Good evening. Welcome to the Bellevue Congress Hall in this beautiful town of Biarritz. Jean-Pierre was saying this in the introduction. This is the heart of surfing country on the Basque coastline. And the earliest surfers began, and this is a phenomenon which has developed year after year. And this evening's debate will talk about surfing and addictions. Yes, because surfing and drugs have a history of being closely linked, and we'll try to unravel that a little bit in this hour of debate before us. Jean-Pierre was also saying this debate will be followed by the film Kissed by God, which is about Andy Irons, who was 3 times a world champion from Hawaii in the 2000s. He was a legend, and we didn't know at the time, but we knew this after, was that Andy Irons was bipolar, drug addict, notably cocaine, and also opioids and opiates, and Oxycontin, and he died on the 2nd of November 2010 in Dallas, and I think he was 32 years old. And that film will be shown. And I was saying, surfing and drugs and addictions are things that have intermingled since surf landed here on our coastline. There have always been stories of drugs, and you can remember that in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s also. The older ones among us will remember in the Grand Plage in Biarritz, you could see Volkswagens with foreign surfers with blonde hair who came from the Netherlands, Amsterdam. They had just bought the and they bartered with hashish from Morocco as well. And Andy Irons was a champion, and in professional surfing also there's been a history of many addicted surfers who have left us, notably, for example, Kaleo Kalini, a Hawaiian surfer who was one of the very best in the 70s, who died of cancer a few years ago, and there have been others. And there's also beautiful stories like Marco Auriacombe, who overcame his addictions at the end of the 90s, and thanks to surfing became a world champion, and that was in 1999. So there are sad stories, but there are some happy stories also. We'll be talking about this in the debate, and for that I'm pleased to welcome some specialists in surfing, and I'm pleased to say that there are some blonde, bronzed heads, but also there are specialists, and everybody will be pleased with the answers, which we will try to give in the debate. Jebus, welcome. Good evening. Jebus Outre, who's director of the Surfers Journal France, which is the French version of a magazine which talks about the culture of surf, and he's an eminency, and he'll be there as a specialist of the surfing world, and he knows all these famous names and these torturous stories. And next to him, I also have Professor Marc Auriacombe, who's a professor of medicine at the universities of Bordeaux and Philadelphia, Marc Auriacombe, and director of the research unit in CNRA. And next to him, Mr. Dr. Baruch, Guillaume Baruch, who is the general practitioner not far from here and has his clinic, and is also surfing, was the creator of the surfing prevention blog, who tries to raise awareness about prevention and medical risks. And next to him, we have Pilot Local, is a surfer of large waves. Pilou has experienced magnificent things, and he can talk to us about his addiction is surfing, and next to him, another big surfer, Gauthier Garanx. Gauthier Garanx was the surfer who negotiated, or who rode the biggest wave in the planet on the Pélénière near Tsokua. And so he won one of the XXL prestigious trophies, which is, in fact, the most prestigious trophy you can win in World Surf. And next to him, he's also a surfer, bronzed and blonde. But he's also an addiction specialist, Auguste Voisin. And his approach will be very interesting because he'll be able to talk to us about surfing and addiction. And finally, at the end of the row, Hugo Barsayal, who's also a surfer, and I invited him to join us at the last moment. And Hugo also has a complicated life, and he has overcome his addictions. He will be telling us about that too. So this debate is called Surfing, a Drug, a Pathway to Drugs, or a Treatment for Drug Addiction, ? And this will be followed by the projection of the film Kissed by God, and we will be giving you this little teaser.
My name's Bruce Irons. Andy Irons was my brother. My brother was unorthodox, wild. You never knew what you were going to get.
Lindy, it's me. I can't deal with this. I'm sick. I'm throwing up on the plane. This is hell. I'm going to try to sleep all day today. Love you. Bye.
He said he was so sorry for everything. That he was coming home.
Andy carried all of Hawaii by himself. No one really knew exactly how much of a toll it was really going to take.
I'm Andy Irons, 27 years old, been surfing for 20 years.
One of the greatest, badass, rags to riches, rock star surfers that ever lived.
He got so good and so confident so fast.
Andy Irons is the new men's world champion.
We call him the people's champ. You know, he's winning, we're all winning.
Who's the man?
And he was wild and funny, and I liked all that.
My brother's dark side started creeping more into his everyday life.
Sometimes I'll get weird thoughts through my head, like it's a lot of thoughts, a lot of just stuff going on.
Bipolar disorder is not just a brain disorder. You can have this switch to being manic and psychotic.
And he's just looking right through me. He's going, "It's all right, brother, it's all right."
I'm down here right now.
People go overboard with a lot of the drugs.
And then the pills come. That's the one that grabbed a hold of my brother.
Definitely changed him.
Like it was, yeah.
They're handing these things out at Rite Aid or CVS. How bad could they be for you?
Bipolar disorder can be associated with tremendous creativity and drive.
Your mind is working better and faster than everybody else.
He won that contest high on coke and pills. Like no big deal.
I remember finding him on a mattress, barely alive.
There are very few of us who end up achieving greatness. So for those who do achieve that, even burdened by having bipolar disorder is extraordinary.
The crowd goes crazy!
Andy, I think about you every single day. You were my hero. You still are.
When I first got on tour, pretty much everybody on tour partied really hard. You know, blind, shit-faced, drunk. I just couldn't believe it. I'm like, we gotta compete tomorrow. What are these people doing?
We're just kids. We smoked a lot of pot and drink all night. Come home at like 2, 3 in the morning and like stay up and just keep drinking and paddle right out without even going to bed. Just go out and surf. And we lived so loose. It's amazing that we made it through those years.
You know, when he was smoking weed when he was younger, he'd smoke a lot of weed. And then if it wasn't weed, you know, then drinking, a lot of drinking. We're doing coke, a lot of coke and drinking. And then the pills come, a lot of pills. And then once you get on this pill run, the pill run's a hard one to kick, and that's the one that grabbed a hold of my brother. grabbed a hold of a lot of us.
He had this like little orange pill crusher white lid and drop one in and he'd snort the pill, and I was like, what are those things, man? You crazy, get off those, they're fucked. And I couldn't believe that he was having one in the morning, one at lunch, one at night, you know, getting through all day. He started to kind of change, I think, after Kelly come back and won that other world title, I think in 2005, and then you can't really pinpoint it because he was always fucking crazy and having a good time, but I guess that's when, that was right when he got hooked on blueies, and then that was it for me. I was kind of, it was all fun at the start, and then I guess no one knew of how those things were and how addictive they were. You know, partying with other things was always fun and easy and whatever, but those things, I think, changed him. Everything slowed down and surfing went out the window and barely free surfed. He used to just surf so much, and then he just, you know, didn't free surf as much, and yeah, that changed it.
What pill did you just take?
Yellow.
Is that a yellow guy?
Yeah, right here I got, what I have here is, we got the hydrocodone for the back. We have the Valiums for the sleeping disorder. Right. And we have oxycodone. This is extremely, like if you're in real big pain, pharmaceutical grade.
You're really breaking.
We had in 2014 more Americans dying of a drug overdose than we had dying from AIDS at the height of the AIDS epidemic. The CDC is calling this the worst drug addiction epidemic in United States history.
I heard about when Andy first went to rehab. It was really kind of squashed. It wasn't, no one talked about it. Like, it was never written up. It was, I mean, if a guy goes to rehab in football or baseball, you hear about it. You know, if some celebrity goes to rehab, you hear about it. But there was no write-ups about it. You know, nobody talked about it other than behind closed doors, you know. I remember feeling like I wish it was exposed. You know, because at the end of the day, I care about people more than I care about a surf contest, you know. Even a guy I hate, you know, or I feel like I hate when I'm competing against him. I didn't wish that on Andy to embarrass him, but I definitely wished it on him to help him. I wish he was able to be public about it, and I felt like there were forces stopping that from happening.
Voilà, projection du film Kiss by Dog, by God.
So the film will be displayed tonight, starting at 8, and the entire film will be subtitled in French, which is a piece of information which is pretty useful for French speakers. Also, there are microphones in the room, so if you want to ask questions or if you have comments, please feel free to. This is a free open debate. Now, the first speaker is the last one who arrived and joined us on stage, and I'm going to ask the first question as a specialist of the history of surf. Gibus de Outre is the founder of a surf magazine. So Gibus, all surfers have a reputation for smoking weed. So why is that? Well, it's true that surf and drugs shouldn't be a taboo. Those are intertwined stories. And I'm very quickly going to discuss two parts of that story. I have a 50-year experience in surfing, and I would say that drugs, in talking about hashish, marijuana, and then hard drugs, as it were, started in the industry in the 70s, when the hippie counterculture and the fight against the Vietnam War, and with a sort of debauchery of new experiences that the American youth would like to experience as a new way of life. So they would experiment all sorts of drugs. And it's true that the surf community was very much involved in that. Now, the previous generation, so the pioneers in Hawaii, and I heard that from big wave surfers from the 60s. They also became addicts to alcohol. And so there's a connection between surf and surfing and spending your energy in partying. And I'm not going to create too many parallels, but I remember someone, and I think you mentioned his name. The name of the surfer is Jeff Ackman. And Jeff Ackman, I remember telling me there was a book named Mr. Sunset. It's a biography. And he was amongst the first who said he was an addict to heroin. And I knew him. I interviewed him on a number of occasions on this topic, among others. And when he was 14, he would surf waves as big as 5 to 6 meters in Hawaii. He was very gifted. And he said, yes, I went through that. And then I had that experience with drugs. And then one day I had... while I was injected heroin, I experienced a flash. I experienced a very strong experience. And then he was looking for that type of experience, of feeling. And so there's certainly a parallel between experiencing this type of feeling and extreme sports. And this started with a partying habit. And at least my generation, drugs were part of the partying atmosphere. In the 70s, there was even a mystique attached to that. So you're not losing yourself in drugs, but there was a connection with the cosmos, everything that you would, the sort of new age beliefs of the 70s. Now, of course, if you take drugs while you party, and then you're young, and then you feel free and fresh in the morning. Now, as life unravels, then and you go through hard times or hardships, then drugs become nothing less but a way to help you go by. And then there's a shift between soft drugs and hard drugs. And I remember the 80s on the Basque coast, where there was that shift between soft drugs and cocaine. And a number of friends of mine died because of that. Now, what's pretty sad about this is that, on a personal note, I saw that happen again on the generations that followed. So it seems that each generation seems to have a number of drama with drugs, and Andy Irons seems to be very emblematic of that. The North Shore, which used to be the center for big wave surfing in the 80s, had a very poor reputation because of gangs and drug lords fighting each other. So it's for sure it's one aspect of the surf industry that you didn't hear very much about. And Kelly Slater one day told me, well, I'm a world champion because the others do not do what is needed to become world champion. All this to say that the other competitors were drug addicts. So that's an evil which is here in this industry. And conversely, and I'm going to stop here, I was also the witness of people finding solace in surf. And so you have drug in other industries as well, in the art industry, in the music industry. And there were a number of victims to drugs. Now, in the surf industry, when you are an addict to heroin and you're trembling in your bed and shaking, of course you no longer want to go and surf. And so if surfing is stronger of an addiction, then you stop and you go back surfing. And so there are very nice stories as well. Gene Hackman, twice in his life, was really hitting a rock bottom with drugs, and today he's 70 and still surfing. So surf can also be a good redemption, a good way out of drugs. Thank you, Gibus. So you said the connection between surf and drugs in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, when somehow we changed gears, if I may say, in drugs. And Andy Irons mentioned that as well. Now, today, I would like to ask a question to Guillaume and Augustin. Today, do you still consider surfers as drug addicts? And if so, why? Why do they have this reputation? So they have a tanned skin, but do they inject something else under that skin as well? So this is a complicated question. There are a number of stories out there about this connection. But there are also behaviors that are very similar to drug addicts. So behaviors in surfers that are reminiscent of those using drugs. So they have behaviors. They are really addicts to surf, and so they will keep going back to the water. And I don't know whether one of you sitting in the audience, when you started at a young age, you start with a phase of addiction. You're obsessed with that. That's the only thing you can think about. And school sort of fades in the background, and your home fades in the background as well, and you're just addicted to that. It's really the center of your universe. And people in society, when they see young people or older people checking the weather forecasts, checking the webcasts today, spending their day on the coastline, and when you think about how expensive fuel can be, spending so much money on cruising along the shoreline. And also when there are parties organized, it's true that most of the time surfers, they tend to be heavy drinkers. Well, we have few scientific data backing the fact that they are more addicted than others, surfers. But at least there was a study published in 2015 in the Netherlands, published by the medical students. And they said that surfers tend to have more at-risk consumption of alcohol and drugs. So maybe later we'll explain why there's this increased consumption. But it's true that they have an addiction to surf, and therefore they potentially have the risk of developing a true addiction to substances. And it's true that the industry of tobacco and alcohol understood that very well. You can still find ads for alcohol beverages or tobacco ads in surf magazines. The first contest was, the sponsor was Smirnoff, which was a vodka-containing beverage. And so today we have cannabis derivative products, even if you do not have THC inside. But again, I suppose that we're more vulnerable than others. And so somehow it's a backdoor to addiction. And then again, you have this party behavior, especially here in the southwest of France. There was this connection. Well, we could also say that surf goes beyond its sports. It's a culture in itself. Well, when I was younger, I would surf the entire day. I would surf hard and party hard. And in the Australian culture, that's also what they do. Now, things have changed. We have more and more surfers with a very clean behavior, and they don't drink, they don't smoke, and they only surf. However, we still have people with those at-risk behavior, and they do not dare to talk about it. Drug prevention has reached a sort of standstill, and I still meet younger surfers in my practice, and they no longer make a distinction between soft drugs and hard drugs, and those people will consume cocaine, and that they're not even aware that this is a drug, because it's part of a party thing. And so surfers certainly are at risk of developing an addiction, and I'm sure that's why we should develop a more targeted prevention towards that population. Now, I'd like to ask Dr. Auriacombe, what is the precise definition of addiction? Well, thank you. Well, if I were to define an addiction, in the last 50 years, this definition has changed very much. A number of studies have been conducted in the last 50 years, and therefore our understanding has also changed. Today, the more operational addiction is losing control when you use a source of gratification. So, to begin with, the product that you use or what you do is a source of pleasure. And you all notice that when you find something that you like, it creates a motivation. Oh, it was good. What can we do it again? And everybody noticed that the things we like more, or the things we like the most, sometimes we can stop using them when they're still available. So we don't stop because you're short of something, you're short of waves, you're short of alcohol, the bottles are empty, but you are able to stop. Or because you're too tired when you're completely exhausted. So a long time ago, the first doctors, medical doctors, had the following hypothesis, that there was a control system thanks to which you could stop. And as any control system, such a system is complex and can stop operating properly. And when someone is addicted, this control system no longer works properly. What's the difference between addiction and dependency? Well, thank you for the question. Now, again, a very tricky question. And that's a real issue. The word itself is a problem. So on the one hand, you have a normal word, as it were, in which we live. And in parallel to that world, there are particular worlds, the world of, but also the world of science, the world of sports, the world of arts. And the same word is going to be used in those different worlds with different meanings. Addiction, dependency may mean the same thing. Being dependent on something or depending on something is losing control on a source of gratification. So addiction and dependency in such a meaning has the same meaning. However, dependency also is used to say that you depend on the weather, or you depend on something which is not harmful, but it's also used to explain behaviors through which you cope or you adapt to something. In the past, we thought that addiction had a different meaning, but today we have different understandings. So whether it is the cause or the consequence of losing control, but it's something different. So you were talking about the words we use, which are going to be perceived differently according to the world in which you operate. For instance, we usually, among surfers, you say that you are addicted to surf. So you do have that notion of passion. And sometimes we make a confusion because, again, it's a fine line. It's a fine line between addiction and being dependent on something. But you should make a difference between passion, commitment, doing things at your utmost. And when you are passionate, of course, you can do beautiful things. When, on the contrary, addiction is going to be an obstacle. A number of studies demonstrated that people, public performers, artists, when they have an addiction, when they are actively addicts, they are not productive because they lost control. And so you do not have control and you are disorganized. So to give you a concrete example, you should not make... when you have a symphonic orchestra and you have a very nice movement and you have a director giving a sort of consistency, and then you have the same orchestra with the same instruments, but then the director lost control, and then it's just going to be terrible. So addiction is the moment when the director loses control, when passion makes you do great things. And of course, when you live with someone with a passion, sometimes it's not always easy to live with someone with a passion. I'm talking about the procès, I'm talking about the parents or the spouse. So sometimes it's difficult, but it's very different from living with someone with an addiction. And today, when you see the film, you'll see that very well. You know, there was also an underlying psychiatric condition, but the moments when you do see how difficult it is to live with someone with that. My next question, I would like to ask my next question to the other surfers, Gibus, Joël, Gauthier, Augustin. Once in your life, did you think that you were addicted to surf? Well, in fact, I would like to pick up on the medical side of things. I saw a scientific diagram explaining the impact of surfing on our brain. When we surf, our brain is going to release dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins as well. Thank you. And so it's as if we were taking 3 drugs at the same time. So it's a rush. It's a rush to the brain. Yeah, we're going to talk about it again. So this is what I wanted to add. This is an interesting take on this. When you talk about endorphins, and again, I would like to talk under the control of Professor Auriacombe, endorphin means endogenous morphines. So it's a type of morphine which is secreted. Serotonin and dopamine can also be secreted or released when you take drugs. And so you have this triple sort of addiction. Yeah, hence my question, Hugues. Did you feel you were addicted by surf? Well, at some point, until the age of 32, I was addicted to surf. But today, and the day I stopped surfing, I started drugs because there was such a void, such an empty space that I had to compensate with something. So you are looking for a compensation, right? You know, the nirvana that I could find in surf, I looked for it in different substances. Oh, okay, I will be asking this question again because this will be the second part of the debate, but it's very interesting. Pilot, well, congratulations, Hugues. Dopamine, I think, was a word that we hadn't mentioned, and so I'm a big wave surfer, and this is true that when you do that, you're looking for dopamine. When you have a very good surf session, some go and have a beer, and basically you want to celebrate. So today I drink a beer. In the past I would smoke pot. Cannabis, I smoked cannabis for 15 years, solid years, day and night, and I apologize to my parents if they listen to that. Other drugs I tried, but I didn't want to go to bed at 10 when you have the biggest waves. So this is something that I didn't follow. But surf for me is a drug, and big waves are a passion of mine. And so I'm going to really make a distinction between both. And thank you for your explanation. Yeah, big waves, you do not have big waves every day. And so about big waves, I told you this story the other day. I surfed the biggest wave matrix in California. I almost died. I almost died under the water. And I told this story to Gibus when I came back from California. And Gibus saw me cry when I talk. I still have goosebumps thinking about that. It was 5 years ago. Every time I tell the story, I feel like crying. And yet, under the water, when I was under the water, it was the most beautiful time of my life. And so when I finished that session, the surfers in Santa Cruz, which are pretty addicted to big waves, and they also do drugs very much. And I thought, well, if someone were to offer me drugs, well, I think I would take drugs, because I would like to remain in that atmosphere, in that spirit. And so I do understand how you can have a bridge between surfing and drugs. Well, my drug today is alcohol. I drink a couple of beers after a surf session, but I had addiction issues, and so sometimes I know how to stop. So you're addicted to surf, but you keep a form of control, right? Yeah, well, because I know the risks. I have children as well, and so I do not want to, I don't want to leave them by the wayside, and I know the risks. Gauthier, your biggest wave was 19 meters. Do you remember how you felt after that, in the minutes, in the hours that followed? Oh, yes, yeah, I do remember that vividly, as if it was yesterday. That was in December, 2 days before Christmas. A beautiful swell in Belara. I was very fortunate to be able to surf one of the biggest waves, so 19 meters, indeed. And at the bottom of the wave, I was completely swallowed. And so I hit rock bottom, and when I was at the surface, the jet skis were rushing to the other side. We were rushing to the channel, because I didn't realize that a second wave was coming my way and was going to hit me on my head. So you're just floating, and your head is hardly out of the water, and you can't even see the sky. You just see a black wall of water. And so I thought, well, I'm never going to come out of such a situation. But it took me more than 1 week to realize really what happened. Back then, I was working at a DIY store called Leroy Merlin, so I went to work, and I think that it really saved me, and I think it prevented me from going through everything that we mentioned so far. I never experienced with drugs, and just hearing you talking about it, I feel like running away, and I think that's because the way I practice big wave surfing is like an athlete. A lot of training. I have an almost scientific approach to it, how I'm going to enter the wave, how I'm going to surf it, what are the impediments that I'm going to use. Because we all have a different background, but I'm an athlete in gymnastics. I did that for 20 years. I went through phases where I would train 25 hours a week. So I have a culture of training, and I find that in my big wave surfing experience. So you said that a week after you were high, as the drug addicts would say. Could you describe in more details how you felt? Do you think that it's close to what a drug addict could experience? Well, from what I've seen in movies, well, yeah, I was walking as if I was a cosmonaut. I was physically in the store, but my mind was not there. My wife was so angry at me. And the night when I came back for the first session, she immediately understood that I was physically there, but my mind was not with her. And 2 days before, I really was a hustle, excuse my French, it was a real hustle. At home, 2 days before a surf session, I'm already thinking about my surf session. I'm not a nice person to live with. 48 hours before I go on a surf trip. I also had this experience. I also surfed in Nazaré with Gautier, and after a session for 3 days, it's true that you're floating, you're hardly walking. And as he said with his wife, when I came back from California, my ex-wife said, "Did you look at you? Have you seen your eyes? You're high." My eyes looked as if I had taken heroin. Look, you were an addict to a number of substances. Can you talk about it, if you don't mind? Well, I also had an experience with big waves. I spent a lot of time under the water, and on that day I was also high on drugs. And so I have the same experience. It's a near-death experience. So it was a sort of corridor. You're under the impression that you're about to die. And it's hard to come back from such an experience. It creates a sort of dissociation. And so you're high because you've almost seen the Holy Virgin. What was your question again? So you experience very strong sensations. And I didn't know that you spent such a long time under the water. Yeah, I also used drugs to try and push my limits. Which drugs, if you don't mind? All of them. Psychostimulants. I surfed high on those type of drugs, like anti-irons did, Ritalin as well. But it was for me to spend more time in the water, so that I was not tired. I was really pumped high with those drugs or different substances. And, you know, when you have a very nice session, it was said before, when you had a beautiful session and you performed very, very well, you want to party. And then, of course, you partied hard until the early hours of the morning, and therefore you feel tired in the morning. And so in order to be able to go surfing, then you use psychostimulants again. And so 24 hours a day, you're on something. And this is really what I experienced. Yeah, that's the main danger, right? Yeah, I would like to draw a parallel between the experience that you can have as a surfer and also the addiction behavior. Basically, what you're looking for is pleasure. And so you're looking for that sensation, and you're going to repeat the same behavior and behaviors, even if you know that they are risky. And so you have the craving and the losing of control, and you experience that very well. In what Gautier described and in what Pilou describes, despite the fact that you had a traumatic experience, again, it's not fear creates addiction, but it's really that sensation, that exhilaration that really creates that craving. And today, Gautier does everything he can to experience the same feeling again. And so this could be described as an addiction to big waves, or maybe a misuse or abuse. And again, not in a negative way, because the way he describes it is pretty healthy. Now, you said, do you feel addicted to surf or drugged by surfing? Now, when surfers enter the water, there's tension building up. There's a build-up in tension. So you need to check the weather forecast. You need to be right time, right place. You need to know the right spots. So you have that knowledge, and there's a build-up of tension. And then you go in the water, and then you have to paddle. You have to cross a bar. And then there's a very quick release of dopamine and all the substances that we mentioned before, and a sensation of intense pleasure. And this is really what creates addiction, and this is what you're looking for when you surf. And of course, if we draw a parallel with drug consumption, it creates. If you're taking drugs, it sort of creates the same feeling, but tenfold. And you have also the weaning feeling. So you have that very intense feeling, which makes it possible for the person to keep repeating the same behaviors, even if they feel that they lose control, even if they feel that they are at risk. And addiction can be found in sports as well. Of course, there are specific profiles. There are people out there that are looking for the source of high, but it's something that we sort of better know. And so the day before you go out surfing, you hardly sleep, right? And it's true that I felt better when the waves were bigger. So when the wave is 3 meters high, I feel short of oxygen because I'm so used to them. And when the waves are 6 meters high, I feel a lot better. I breathe better because, again, I'm really having a very good time.
I have a theory with regards to that. I think that we all drugged or potentially drug addicts. The difference that was the subject of my question. In fact, Professor Auriacombe, does it make sense to say that you're drugged up? It could be sex, it could be work, it could be addicted. But the problem is indeed that drugs has a pejorative connotation. Well, addiction to drugs, but there are people who do not consider themselves to be drugged, but they take anxiolytics every day. And then there are, of course, addictions without a substance like surfing. It could be any kind of sport. It could be an activity. And when we talk with people, everyone has their own way of lowering their levels of stress. But the aim, really, in the end, is to guide people towards healthy addictions, and surfing is one of them. And it's true, I consider I'm drugged with the ocean, I'm addicted to the ocean. I've never spent a fortnight in my life since I've learnt to swim without going to the ocean. And if it happens to me, I would be very fearful of the consequences. So if I couldn't go, so that's how I manage it. But you have to be well aware that you can go, you are at risk of going too far. And it's not so simple because we can all become addicted. We're talking about surf that generates this high tension with a reward which is very brief, which is the anticipation, the wave. Are there other sporting disciplines that are comparable to this? Professor Guillaume, doctor? Well, I think the riskiest sports, the sensational sliding sports, for example, and surfing is addictive because of the sensations that it provokes and because of the environment, because there's the ocean, which gives a lot of benefit, and the sun. There are people who develop a kind of addiction to the sun, and so much so when you begin to do less surf, and then you get a seasonal depression, and then risk sports are intensive sports that are being done much more, CrossFit, trailing. They're all very intensive and addictive, but behind them, complicated to do throughout a lifetime because you can't do them so intensely as you get older. But what I notice more and more is people who do CrossFit without any problems for 5 years, and at that moment in time they no longer can, and then they have great difficulties with regards to their emotional state in order to maintain that life comfort, and so it is a risky and dangerous practice. But can you find that in surf? Gibus, you're the most veteran of all the surfers here. So, well, two things. Well, one thing, drawing from my personal experience, I was a big wave surfer. I was the generation before Pilot, and it wasn't 8 meters. We were more doing 4 and 5 meter waves, and there were fewer of us. And I think it's true, but I don't think it was really an addiction. But it was rather, it was the fact that we respond to the swell, and obviously we have a professional life also, and sometimes you can't do it. And I had a job, and there you don't feel good then and particularly with the big waves, because an ordinary surfer, a small wave surfer, does it over and over again, but a big wave surfer on 1.5 meters, 2 meters, you can do 4 or 5, but with a big wave you have 1 or 2, or sometimes you get into the water and you don't even find a big wave. So the challenge is much greater to respond to that. So there was all of that you have to think about also. And I have personally participated, also said to myself, when am I going to let go? Somebody's going to tell me that I know that there are super waves and or great waves, and I'm not going to be there. But and this has taken time. I'm more than 60 years old now, so getting rid of the cold turkey has taken some while. So there's this passion of responding to the swell. Is it a passion, an addiction? I will allow a specialist to talk about this with regards to another sport, and I've met people like this, best windsuit, best jump, and then that's an addiction to playing with death. Perhaps you've heard of a great adventurer, who was called Jean-Marc Boivin, who was a great fan, and he did huge jumps, and they were in Chamonix, and you had cable car pylons, and they did base jump from the top, and then they opened the parachute at the last moment. That was a base jump parachute, and that is something that's addictive, and he died from it, in fact. And so is it the adrenaline high? Well, most probably it is, and there's that we have to think about. So surfing can be a drug, yes. I'm talking to the surfers and also Professor Auriacombe and the expert on addiction. Well, as long as it can be a source of pleasure or something that we want to repeat, that really connects up your control system. That can lose control. Everybody has a potential risk, and any kind of pleasure has a potential to be addictive. But there are things that are more addictive than others, and makes you feel a very intense experience. The more it generates a motivation and the risk of a loss of control. After all that, we have to differentiate. We did mention this, but this is also a very important subject, and that's the risks and risks management. Any action, taking a risk is not necessarily an addiction, but when you have an experience that is very intense, that mobilizes risk, that there's ways of doing it and precautions to be taken in order to reduce the level of risk and to ensure that you'll be able to enjoy it without having just one session where you die afterwards, even if the feeling can be at any moment in time that it is so extraordinary. Why not? Let's give the floor to you. But I think our lives are surrounded by that. A drug addict only thinks about that, and we just think about surfing. And of course, you get saturated as we get older. But our aim, he still goes on 4-meter waves. So he tries not to, but he hasn't really stopped surfing. So what I'm saying really is that you surf until the very end, and a drug addiction ends up taking less drugs because he gets saturated, but he still takes some. And that's the same in surfing. We still continue doing it. Well, I think I surf my daughter. I don't go surfing anymore because it implies all the I've broken it. I don't feel like getting in the water anymore since I've had my daughter. Blacks are full of articulates, and I'm 34, and my back, my spine is about 50 years old. But Hugues was the first surfer to do all kinds of twists and turns, and I met once a big surfer called Peter Cole, and he belonged to the pioneers of surfing. And he went to Anglet, and he's more than 80 years old now. I met him in the 1980s, and he became a friend. And he did know, or he met all the pioneers, the early adrenaline pioneers, because they were wondering whether they were going to die in that Weimar wave. And he always said that those who surf all their lives are those who work. And that really struck me, because he saw that, and I also saw that in the 70s. It's like what Hugues says, when you only do that, well, there's an overdose. And then sometimes there's bad weather, and then there's no good waves, and then you start taking drugs. And he saw his generation got lost in alcohol, the next generation with drugs. And he had 3 friends, a Greek oceanographer called Ricky Grigg, and they worked, they were teachers, and then lecturers, then oceanographers, and he surfed until 75, until he had a back problem and he couldn't surf anymore. So he surfed at the weekend, and when there were waves, there weren't any waves, well, he couldn't go, obviously. But I think that is a truth. I acknowledge that I still surf today, obviously, because I have a job. But I think that's very important to have that structure, and that gives that dosifies the addiction. This is a question that I have. Is it true that not genetically, but there are profiles? Have you been able to observe of people who have the same dose of practice or the same dose of getting accustomed to product, and those others who really fall into addiction, and others who don't? I'll let the professor answer that question, but it's very interesting what you're saying, and I would like to add that what Peter Cole describes when he talks is those who are not addictive and work and maintain their jobs can surf for a long time, whereas those who are addicted will surf for a while. They hurt their knees and back, and they end up by compensating by drinking alcohol and drugs and whatever. So to the question before, are you drugged or hooked on surf in the common language? Yes, but in scientific language, no. Why? Because not everybody is going to develop an addiction. Nobody is going to surf until the wife leaves them, until they get sacked from their job, or until their husbands leave them, because there are women surfers. Everybody is not going to accumulate negative experiences. And what you said is quite right. Those who are going to work surf a lot and not going to accumulate negative. Those who are not addicted. And Hugues has something very interesting to share. You said he surfed and he worked, you were saying. And Gautier, he works and surf. And Pilou works and surf. And I was paid to surf. That's different. So I was paid to perform, to do more and more and more. Anxiety of end of year, am I going to be gotten rid of? Anxiety, the concern about performing, and all of that is unhealthy. It is unhealthy. And that killed Andy Irons. I know. I didn't know Andy Irons. I did meet his friend, but I saw the pressure, the media, the media and the French media are pretty cool, but the sponsors, but they're renewing contracts, do this, don't do that, and in the end, I think that we protect ourselves by working and surfing. When the surfers are vulnerable, but we don't see that. Everybody thinks that we've got a dream life that's magnificent. They're paying you to surf, but in the end, it's not as beautiful as that. You'll see it in the film. They have to deal with anxiety, stress, performance, and so on. So you're right. To work as well. Well, it's crazy because Hugues was quite right. I began to surf when I was age 12, and I'm 43 now, so I've been surfing for 30 years now. So it's quite a while. And since I was a kid, I've been following Hugues and all the best French surfers who had it, who surfed for a job. I did surfing whilst having a job at the same time. By working hours, and I just went to surf on Saturday or Sunday, and not being finicky about whether there were big waves or not, because otherwise you wouldn't go out. And so I maintained that hunger for surfing, not blasé at all. There was no pressure, and in my personal history also, I met the fame and success, but very late when I won XXL, I was 38, not age 16, but you had all the Spencer. You did cover, you worked on magazine covers and so forth. But I was very protected really by having a job. And at 38, you've been working for a while. You're married. You're very wrapped up and protected, and so it's not like a young 16-year-old stars who are weaned, and you're just better built and better surrounded. And I went to Los Angeles to pick up the prize XXL, but the following week I had to work at the cash desk in the supermarket again. So that brings you back to earth, and so you had to, work in the cash desk, and then you plan your weekends to be able to. So you can make a differentiation between the professionals and the Sunday amateurs. I saw Gautier on Facebook. I wrote congrats with 2 S's with a $sign. As a journalist, I met some great champions, Tom Curren and Tom Carroll particularly. These are people who, at the end of their careers, I saw they dived, and Tom Curren really dived and fell. And it was stunning. And I talked with Tom Carroll, Tom Curren, not many. These are 2 former world champions, and there was one, Tom Carroll, who got hooked on cocaine, and Tom Curren, who had a very difficult phase in his life, because he became hooked on heroin and then alcohol, and then he managed to get over it. And that happened at the end of their careers. But what happened was also for a champion, they have a life. They're stuck in their tours. They have their goals, and they're always fighting for results. They go around the world, but they never leave the hotel or the beach, and so they are really limited to a particular context. And they're taken when they're age 16, and they do that until they're age 30, and then they stop touring at age 30, and then they have to catch up the life that we have had. We have matured between 18 and age 30. We've gone through all the different stages of life, but they still have to do that, and they have to learn everything in just 1 year. And at the same time, the fixing points, the points of reference that they have are sporting points of reference. I win or I don't win, and also sports points of reference, the feeling of sport. And we say to ourselves, well, he surfs magnificent, because but they know that they are losing it, and so they have no point of reference anymore. And then they take a big dive, and they sink really. and this happens in many sports, in cycling, for example. But you take drugs to do cycling. But there's difficult over this very high level sports person who suddenly has to get back into ordinary, normal life, and at the same time their points of reference in life and their glory is now part of the past. And those points of reference, which are all to do with sport, well, they slide and they sink, and that if they're not everybody is a Jean-Claude Killy, the great cyclist, but you're talking about champions who came to the end of their careers. But there are very young surfers who've got Cheneberry, for example. He got in the 90s, an Australian. He reached the heights, and or Nicky Wood also, and then sunk rock bottom. But of course, it's the person surrounding that person. If the person is alone, they won't get there. But then afterwards, if there's a person in addiction, well, I've been faced with there are many colleagues that were hooked to heroin, and that's horrible. That's horrific, really, because the traitors, they will say yes, 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 don't worry. You will get out of it. I'll give you some money to walk out, and then you discover there's nothing. He's just gone to get more drugs. So it can only come from the bottom of that person, and it's very difficult to handle and manage. Okay, this is the second part of the debate. Is surfing a threshold or an entrance door towards taking other drugs? But Guillaume, let's say, surfers were a higher risk population, but in the end, are there as many drug addicts, or is there the same proportion as in the population? For example, bridge players or bowls player. Well, that would be you have to do a targeted. For example, members of the French Surfing Federation, but I would like to see that analysis of the general state of health of surfers to be able to see that. But the data that we have objectively insinuate that there must be quite a few more than in the general population. And one of the explanations is that surfing is an activity that for just a very small dose gives you very, very intense sensations, much more than pétanque or boules. Yes, probably. Well, it depends. If you've had a glass of Ricard, a glass of liqueur. Well, surfing, there was a study that was done which showed that 30 minutes of surfing session is enough to improve the positive emotions of a person. We will talk about that at the end of the debate, because that is another question that you're raising there. The welfare or the good feelings that surfing are about of axing. The more intense the reward is with the wave, and as the professor said, the more the risk there is of you falling into an addiction, and it can be an entrance door. So it is very important to tell surfers from a very young age to have an open discourse when you're parent, to talk about that when they're young, to talk about cannabis and alcohol openly, and to give them that warning by telling them don't fall into that, because indeed a surfer who is going to also fall into one or several addictions is going to be at risk and will have difficulties getting out of that, particularly when things go badly and for example, injuries, and that happens sooner or later, which leaves you dry for weeks or months, and that is when you begin to sink. It could be also study, work that distances you from the ocean. That is why you have to manage to keep that proximity without keeping that addiction, but you also have to keep that contact with the surfing in a reasonable way, to keep control. That is really important, and I think that is the key word, to keep control. Well, the control system, the control is something that you have to grab a hold of, that you have to train, you have to educate it. And in the stories that you've been telling, the comment made that those who, together with surfing, maintain other activities or a job or is also something that helps them to control the surf better. Because there's a simplistic prevention message, don't do dangerous things. But for people who don't like that, that's not a problem. But people who've had that experience and who've discovered that that is interesting, to tell them not to do that is not realistic, really. But if you do that, however, you have to have the concern of keeping control, of being able to control your speed, and that is easier to do if you have other sources of interest. To work in a supermarket like Leroy Merlin is not totally lacking of interest, is it? Well, I think, but so being you can find other pleasures and interests which without doubt are not as intensive. Obviously, being a cashier in the supermarket is not, but the pretension of developing an addiction is to have, you have to have other sources of gratification to vary, so that depending on the situation, you can, at any moment in time, make sure that your brain can have that pleasure. Well, we've identified among surfers that there are various families. There are, on the one hand, the professionals, which Hugues belongs to, with all the pressure that we have. The Sunday surfer, who will do their 1 or 2 meter waves, the little wave, just for the pleasure of doing it, of keeping fit, and for the feelings and sensations. But then there's another category, and we have some marvelous examples, and these are the large wave surfers, and they are seeking big sensations, and the searchers for sensations are a family apart, and whatever the discipline that might be, and that involves risk practices with the possibility of being addicted. Yes, the searching for big sensations or feelings, that's interesting because our brains have to be stimulated, everyone. But there are people who have a very low threshold. So that means that, well, you just get up in the morning and you try to put your socks on to experience a moment of ecstasy or risk, incredible risk. And that'll cover you for the day. But there are other people, however, who need a little bit more. So somebody who looks for big sensations are people who have a very much higher threshold, and to stimulate their brains, they need, as is normally necessary, these people need to do things that are very, very risky, as seen from the exterior, for people who have a lower threshold. So let's get back to surfing. To have the experiences, the formidable experiences that you've been talking about, you have to get in the water, so you mustn't fear water to start with, and then and you have to go in front of the wave, and you have to. There are people who will. You're not going to stop at the waves right by the beach. So you have to have a threshold, a high threshold of feeling that will allow you. And there's a whole series of surveys for humans and animals that have a threshold of high threshold of sensations is associated to a higher risk of developing an addiction. So that at the same time, the solution that they're not happy, on the other hand, if they're not stimulating their brain. So you have to go with them so that people know that vulnerability. And the difficulty with a professional surfer and all of that is that the vulnerability, therefore, it's always good to transform those vulnerabilities into strengths, but you have to know that has to be something that you have to be careful about. And otherwise, in the story that you described, if you suddenly reinforce the risk, it can get out of hand, and then when you want to stop, then you're going to use other things, and their substances really have fast and immediate and easy effects, and that's what we have at hand. And that is what's most available is alcohol, heroin, cocaine is a little bit less developed, but once you find it, then it becomes available.
Hence, going from one to the other, one substance to the other. Now, I'm going to open another debate, still in connection with addictions and drugs. Luc, you already answered this question when you said that you would take products to be able to surf more. And for big wave surfers, you also mentioned that you try to push the limits. Do some surfers use drugs, dope? Yes, no, and if yes, is it considered as a drug? Well, Pilou talked about mavericks. And in surf, we talk more about a more psychological type of addiction. Now, mavericks, there was an entire generation when they would use. For those of you, is one of the spots which is to the south of San Francisco, with loads of white marks, and there are victims, people who die there every year. And so the surfers who would surf there, Peter Meyer, just to mention one, would take different substances to because they didn't want to, and they thought they'd never die. They could not die because or thanks to drugs. They thought as if they were invincible, and so it's a form again. It's a psycho-stimulating drugs or hormones. Well, it was prepared as if it was going to war. However, we have example in Santa Cruz where they started with that type of behavior and then they become hooked up to drugs. Well, yes, when they stop surfing, they tend to compensate or overcompensate with drugs. So they surf using high on amphetamines, and then when they stop surfing and drugs, then they resort to something even stronger. Is it a subject of open discussion among surfers? Do you discuss the products you take? Well, I think that surfers are more clean. Well, we don't talk about it, but sometimes we have doubts or suspicions. But the WSL encouraged surfers to take EPO. But I think that we, surf it will be an Olympic sports, and so we'll have to comply with all the respective legislation. Now, professional surfers were almost never tested. We only have the example of Nico Pedeiras, a Brazilian surfer. He was tested positive to anabolizing drugs in France. Why in France? Well, because France was always sort of at the forefront when it comes to fighting against drug abuse. Now, there's a very interesting paper in Sport where a French surfer said that French surfers are the only one in the world being submitted to those controls. And he said in that paper that in the Anglo-Saxon world, surfers tend to take pills as if they were eating sweets. And so the person was pleading in favor of more harmony in the legislation. In 2007 in Chile, it is said in the film that Andy Irons was high on drugs. But can we consider that this? So you know, there are a number of competitors. They wanted to beat Slater, and they took cocaine to do so. Shell Lasher, to name but a few. You know, there were many out there who wanted to do better than the only one who was always clean. So this is illegal use of those substances. Now, you know that in the sports industry, there are substances that are not considered to be illegal. And I remember an anecdote when there was an occasion when someone was tested positive with one substance like cannabis, and he was able to compete the following day because cannabis was not considered as a substance of abuse, or rather not for sportless. Also, we could find two trends here. So there was a period of time when you had a number of recreational use, and today maybe the substances are being used more to boost performance. Well, when we had the first contests in Espé, the arena surf master, my father was a dermatologist, and he told me that as a dermatologist, he had surfers coming in his practice asking for medicines that would boost their performance. So back then, there was hardly any control. There were a few controls when Andy Irons was a surfer. But when he passed, I think that it changed things. There's a new legislation by the WSL stating that you can be submitted to a test anytime. Now, what's going to change things, really, I think, is the fact that surf is now an Olympic sport. And so by next year, there will be more controls. But as Hugues said, when some already have found the type of products that you can take and that cannot be found in tests, as is the case in the cycling industry, well, you know, I think it will help prevent other stories like Andy Irons. Andy Irons was not supported, and he would test different mixes. He didn't have a medical doctor helping him with that. When Andy Irons died, first, it was reported that he died of dengue fever, and we all knew that it was not dengue fever. So there was a sort of secrecy around that. Now, the World Surf League tried to hide that fact because there was a feeling of shame. The entire industry was afraid that it would be detrimental for the league image, and we have and we need to break down this taboo, and this is why I think it's a very good idea that we have such a debate so that it becomes central. So Andy Irons also had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and you understand that in the movie. So he fell in drugs, so to speak, because he was looking for products to remain high. So I'm not a doctor, so maybe I'm not using the right words, but he became hooked up to a number of products, especially a number of products sold in the pharmacy, especially opioids, widely discussed in the United States. And Andy Irons was not the only victim. Michael Jackson Prince were also victims to that. Maybe you could give us more details. The opioids or opiates crisis. So the opiates crisis in the United States can be explained as follows. It was easy to access painkillers containing opiates. Morphine is very useful in medicine because it does alleviate very strong pain. For a long time, such painkillers were underused, and so people were in pain. So it was decided to prescribe them more often, and maybe it was to open the use, and for that reason people started using those drugs, or misuse those drugs. It was also prescribed to people without pain because it has a number of properties or to manage. So it has as a painkiller like heroin. It provides a pleasing feeling, and it can help with a number of psychiatric disorders. So it can help in regulating depression or an anxiety disorder or a bipolar disorder. However, there's a multitude of reasons. And there's a safety margin, which is very narrow. So if at a moment in time you take too many of those pills, then you may die of an overdose. Of course, if you are resuscitated, then of course you can survive such an overdoses, but you stop breathing, and if you're by yourself, then unfortunately you die of such an overdose. And in the United States, in this country, access to healthcare is difficult, to say the least. The United States is one of the countries in which they spend the biggest amount per capita, and yet so many people do not have access to proper healthcare. And so this crisis, this over-mortality because of the opiates crisis, is because there is a number of people who do not have the right access to healthcare. Yeah, we're discussing 70,000 fatality a year. Yeah, about 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, there was a peak. There were more fatalities because of prescription drugs than heroin. And the projections are quite dramatic. Well, the trend is on the decrease. In the last 5 years, people have become more aware of this, so it's on the decrease. But again, there's an underlying issue. The healthcare system does not absorb, is not in a situation which makes it possible to provide healthcare to people in a timely manner. And so people die because they do not have access to proper healthcare, and so they self-medicate. So those are drugs which are legally sold in the pharmacy, but it's just an improper use of those drugs well, we're discussing improper use when the people are looking for a stimulating effect, but also because people are hurt, or they have back pain, or they have a fracture, but also to manage their mood, of their emotions. So they're prescribed, so you have a prescription. In such a case, it's not an illegal drug, but the way they're used, well, the medicine itself is an active substance, and with an instruction for use. And of course, if you do not follow the instructions, a very useful drug can become dangerous. Yes, and therefore an illegal drug with a risk of addiction. Frank, well, sorry, but in the United States, they have super powerful. When you compare morphine with fentanyl and oxycodone, morphine is a baby compared with that. Oxycodone is worse than heroin. There was I remember that I watched something, a show on TV where they said that oxycodone is worse than heroin that you find in the street. And so somehow they said that medical doctors in the United States were forging or creating drug addicts on prescription. Especially in the United States, as I said, when you see the number of fatalities, more fatalities because of drugs on prescription, under prescription. There's also a parallel market with modified fentanyl, which is a fact-acting type of morphine, and the risk of overdoses is very high, and you can die in a matter of a few seconds. Could such a crisis happen in Europe or in France, or is it a typical American problem? Well, this crisis exists in a number of locations. Now, what is specific to the United States is not so much, well, the fact that those products are available and there's not a sufficient level of control, and those drugs were prescribed by medical doctors that were which did not provide sufficient support to their patients. But on the other hand, you have an underlying issue with the healthcare system. The healthcare system which doesn't make it possible for people to access healthcare. We do not have this issue in France. Well, we do have drugs that not used properly, but when they develop an addiction, they can access a proper healthcare system because the time lag is very short. And this is something that people are not very well aware of. For addictions, there are efficient treatments, and the wide public is not aware of that, but there are treatments, so not necessarily painful, but efficient treatments. So access to healthcare, I'm not saying, well, it's not too bad to develop an addiction, but when you have the early signs, you should not wait. You should go and see your GP as early as possible. Well, the figures that I could read, I'm not sure whether they're accurate or not. 10% of people that can access proper healthcare in the United States, and 90% in France. Well, they made progress because it was 10%. Now it's comprised between 15 and 20. But in France, the estimate is that for addiction, opiates addiction, we have 80 to 90% of those people that are being supported by the healthcare system. Therefore, it reduces the risk of overdose and the risk of further lesions. So there's still a risk. There's still a risk. Yes, indeed, there's still a risk, but it's a lot lower. And the rate of overdose in France is a lot lower compared to the United States or comparable European countries, where the threshold is higher, threshold for access to care. And of course, the threshold, the higher the threshold, the higher the risk. Well, I think that Andy Irons was a Frenchman with the access to the French healthcare system. Maybe he would still be alive today. Well, that's one of the major challenges. So you can't say that you are a survivor. You were treated pretty early, and so if you were in the United States, maybe you would not be sitting in that chair here. Well, that's true. A friend of Andy Irons got me hooked up to those drugs, his best friend, and he was the one who introduced me to that. He showed me videos of them partying, and they looked like machines. So they would be taking pills to surf, and then they would party and drink, and for a while I wanted to do the same thing, but I had less money in my pocket than Andy Irons, and so somehow maybe it saved me. But again, when they received money, I did see videos. I shouldn't say that, but they would have a contest of how much drug they could snort on the table, and you know, there was more than $4,000 worth of cocaine on a luxury table, and yeah, it was a contest. And again, the United States are lagging behind. You know, it's a country of the American dream, but when it comes to addiction, they are very late and lagging behind. And the opiates that they prescribed are not adapted. At least that's what I think. Gibus, what would you like to say? Well, there's really a taboo around drugs in our industry. When Surf Session was created, when the magazine was created, I remember one of the magazines in which we talked about drugs, and we received a phone call and from the managing director, and he said that no, you should not talk about drugs. And of course, I do not want to conceal anything, but we do see that there were a number of victims for many years, and so there's this party atmosphere that sort of surrounds the industry, but there's a lot of hypocrisy as well in not seeing how much people suffered, and I think that's very serious. And I think that the movie really shed some light on that. Many people knew that. As a journalist in this industry, of course, I was aware of his story, and I didn't know that he had a bipolar disorder. This was something that was completely hidden. But of course, drugs on such a psychiatric condition, well, of course, drugs can start a condition, but when you have a pre-existing condition, you know, it makes matter worse. And when you see how much of a genius he was, I mean, personally, I think he was the best surfer of all times. He invented gestures and twists and turns probably better than Kelly Slater, and maybe because he had a bipolar disorder. But that man suffered so much, and people knew that. People knew that, or at least they had doubt about it, they had a suspicion about it. And so there are many efforts that should be made. I think the situation is improving from what I saw in how the industry has evolved. When there are schools, I see the generation of my children, they learned how to surf in a group, in a school. And so, of course, they would compete, but they had trainers, and you have to know that many surfers, when they started, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, they had a gift. And someone like Andy Irons, you know, they were two brothers, and they were competing against each other. And then their father was also a surfer, and then they start touring, and then they have sponsors, and they start pushing very hard. And then it gets out of hand. And I think those things have improved because there's much of a structure. There's more a collective take on that. And I think that in France, the situation, I think, is better. France is performing very well collectively in the World Championship, and where we see that there's not drugs in the background. But I think it's good that we shed some light on that, because it's too much pain and too much suffering. I don't agree at all with that idea that now there's more of a group an environment. Well, it's true that you find different profiles because surfing has become more mainstream. And so in the past, we had a number of people who were antisocial, who had a very difficult background, people from broken homes. And when you looked at the cars were not the same back then and now. What they would consume after the session was different. Today, we have more of a mixed population, and maybe we wouldn't start surfing today. Again, when you look at the type of cars that you see on the parking lot, you see beautiful cars, you see high-end equipment as well, and those people are not really in the same, they're not following the same dynamics. So this type of people with this different profile, the profiles that prevailed maybe 40 years ago, those they don't stand out as much as they did 40 years ago. And of course, it's important that we are able to pinpoint addictions and help them access healthcare. So you say that it was more a marginal type of sports 40 years ago. Well, you know, the real surfers I still consider as people at the margin of society. Well, we've all heard about Biarritz Surf Club. Inagua was vice European champion, but he had this specific profile about him. So today, it's true that I think there's more of a frame, there's more of a framework, and so when you have young boys and girls starting to compete, they have reference points, and I think that parents are more educated as well about the risks. Now, Hugues, your generation, do you think that you had less of a framework? Well, my generation, team managers would smoke pot every day, and they would exhale the smoke in our face, and we would say, well, we were 12 or 13, doesn't smell of cigarette. And so we were raised and trained in that sort of atmosphere. So, and our trainers would smoke and then would like to train us. Now, Billabong, they're very nice. They help Marco Chilupo. They paid for his rehab, and Andy Irons, they kept the secrecy. They didn't want to say, and they didn't want to save him as they did later. And I think today things have changed. I think that trainers no longer smoke weed in front of young boys and girls, at least hopefully. But, you know, the brands that are mentioned in that film, you know, they have their share of responsibility. They have their share of responsibility. And Billabong today, I have no respect whatsoever for that brand. You know, they say, well, we saved Oki, he's world champion, but they let Andy die with their secrets and his demons. So I think that there's still a lot of progress to be made, especially if we want to protect the younger generation as well. Don't you think that's the problem? Don't you think that the problem comes from the fact that this discipline for a long time belonged to brands and not to federations? Yeah, it's a sort of mafia. And we were objects, we were puppets. If sales were decreasing, or if you became a father, then they would cut your contract, stop your contract. And professional surfers, you think that they have a dream job, and it's true that you have magical moments in your life, but you don't see the backside of the coin. And the film does show that very well. There are many Andy Irons in the world, only we don't know them, but there are many with a lot of money, and they surf and they abuse. Maybe it's not so much the case in France, but in the United States there are many of them. In Hawaii, the rip curl house would lit up at 3 a.m. in the morning, and then they would go to bed at 10 a.m. with their eyes injected with blood. So, you know, that was not something very nice to see. And you would see all the lights turned on at 3 a.m. in the morning. And so we could see that they had issues. So this was the type of ambience, the type of atmosphere that prevailed back then in Hawaii. And I saw that with my naked eyes. And we were disgusted by that. Well, Hawaii was apparently a problem with ice. Yeah, it's exactly the same sort of platform as in Belgium or the Netherlands. So it was not only opiates. I was introduced to a drug starting with K. They would use, you know, they would use the full package. Yeah, ketamine that you use on horses. Andy adored, loved ketamine. He would use everything and anything, and he had so much money in his pocket, I could have anything that he wanted. So the Belgian pot, at some point, you know, it gets to your head. So it's not only cocaine and opioids, you know, it was a lot more. But ketamine, you can find it on the other side of this border at nightclubs, you know. Yeah, but you know, in Bali, if they find weed in your pocket, you may go to jail. While in the United States, the situation is very different. Now, we talk about doping, about surf, which maybe can be an entry door to that. Now, the last part of our debate, surf can also help cure. We were discussing Marc Auriacombe. He was successful very quickly when he was very young. He was successful at the Prime Master when he was 17 back then in the 80s. And then he went completely under the radar. But because an Australian brand helped him, checked him into rehab, and then when he was 33, he was a world champion again many years later. But he went through a difficult time for maybe 15 years. So there are a few positive examples in this industry as well, when surf can also be very beneficial as well. Well, as an example on Marc Auriacombe, in Sport Revue, there's an article which was published where they described very well what happened when Bartholomew was a friend of him. So for 15 years, Billabong, they never stopped the contract that they had with Marc Auriacombe. So he was not a surfer anymore. He would live secluded in his house. He would take every drug and any drug. He would play at the casino. He had a hard time, of course, with his wife, and then he would hide his money in different spots. And yeah, in Lacano, I know that he buried his boards in the beach. And then there was an anecdote when, well, he liked digging in the ground. And so back then he was 1.75 meters and 120 kilograms. And so he was obese. And And then his friend, former surfer as well, former world champion, wanted to take him to the ocean, and then he was so overweight that he had a hard time surfing again, and so there was this sensation again, and so he started surfing again. So that's a nice story. We don't really know what happened in between, but he managed to get back in shape. And he started touring again, and then in 1999 he became a world champion again. So that's the nice story where surf can help in redemption. There's also the example of Tom Carroll. He was also a world champion. Then he became hooked up to amphetamines, to heroin, and he described some years ago. There's also a broadcast. An Australian journalist followed him, and he explains that surf did help him very much to get out of his addiction. Dr. Baruch, again, you're a general practitioner and a surfer, so you say that you prescribe surfing as a therapy, surf therapy to your patients. Well, again, to pick up on the examples, there are many examples of professional surfers who were able to overcome their addiction. They say that at some point they went through a more rocky part of their path, and so it's important after those people stop their professional career that they find a different job. So a different job with a sponsor, or if they can continue and work in this industry, because that way that's a way for them to get out on the bright side. Now there are different therapies. There are different centers specialized in the treatment of addiction. So yoga, equitherapy, so therapy with horses. So you have different modalities. But surf indeed has many benefits for a multitude of reasons, because you have a positive feeling because of the environment as well. What was the figure? 30 minutes. 30 minutes of surf can increase positive feelings. So it's a treatment which is very quick acting. So you have different support therapies that are implemented in a number of centers. And so I worked a book, and in that book I wanted to create a compilation of different such support techniques. 10 years ago, I thought that people would say I was mad, but I do see that there's a trend, and sports on prescription are very concrete example. In this region here, we can have sports on prescription, so we can prescribe stand-up paddle and surf on a number of indications. For example, for tobacco cessation, when we have patients coming in, we can propose 3 months of paid sports. So they're going to have a coach, and they're going to have 3 months of prescribed sports to help them quit smoking. So this is very concrete, and so we should be aware of that. For some addictions, we prescribe drugs. Some of them work better than others, especially for alcohol. But for other substances, we don't necessarily have the best solution. You don't necessarily have a chemical solution, hence those other therapies, for instance, sports. There's also the example in Bidar, so it's not so far away from here. We have also examples of soldiers being hurt, wounded in a military operation, and we saw them surfing in Bidar. So there are benefits to surf. In the room, we have Jean-Marc Sergeot. He's the founder of the Handy Surf Association. He worked very hard to have people with a disability surf, and he also wants to have people with autism discover surf. And it seems that surf does have a positive impact on people with autism. So there are many stories to tell on the benefits of surf therapy that you briefly mentioned. Well, before Jean-Marc talks, surf therapy for wounded soldiers is one of the best indications. In the United States and in France, is recognized by the military doctors as being one of the most efficient therapies. So the French army every year sends wounded soldiers, but also soldiers with psychological disorder or trauma. So it's post-traumatic stress. So the hidden, invisible brain lesions, when the soldiers find themselves in a depression, when they have suicidal thoughts, they are addicted to medicines. And we have a number of examples of such people being able to benefit from surfing. Autism as well. We work with a number of associations for autistic people with autistic disorders, and it works very well. Now, those people should benefit from this on a longer period of time, because of course if they try, but they try once, it's not going to be very beneficial. So we need to have a proper follow-up and a complete long-lasting management. I would like to say that Gauthier, in the National Association, Handy Surf, is a trainer. And so one round of applause for his commitment as a trainer in this association, because he's a volunteer. So it's not so much big waves, but he does that, and that is very nice. Yeah, and I think that one of my best experience was with autistic people. Jean-Marc Saint-Jean is a founder of Handy Surf, this association. Well, first and foremost, thank you. We know each other very well. I met Hugues when he was very young, and the fact that you're here and the fact that you are a witness today and you provided this testimonial is very heartwarming. I remember one day we were on the lake in Horscore, and I remember him telling me, well, I was more afraid today than I was in Bellara. He was completely panicked, and we're not discussing a mass of black water on his head. He was panicking for no real reason. And Gauthier, I remember when you said that you were so afraid. But anyway, yes, about the association and autism. It started in 2008. Guillaume was present. In 2008, we watched a show. François Rouvrin told me, well, I saw people with autism surf in Mexico, and it's great. Well, back then I didn't even know there was someone with autism, and so we went to Mexico, and it was so much of a shock, and I saw that it was so beneficial to the children that I became certified. Back then it would be in June. There would be a session in June and a session in October, but there was something missing. And so we implemented a method where the children can have a class in the swimming pool. So they can practice in a swimming pool in the summer in good conditions. Because obviously if you do not have classes all year long, then you create frustration, and it's a problem with the condition. So it's very important that you have this sustainable, long-lasting management. So there's autism, there's schizophrenia as well. We also have schizophrenic patients. We have burnout, people completely depleted. And so we have autistic children. We have also people with a burnout, and for war soldiers, wounded soldiers, also we have a post-trauma session. So we had that for people with a physical injury and those with a post-traumatic disorder. And I think that I remember a session with Eric in Bida and with Rachel as well. And I remember it was very hard. Anyway, I'm very happy to see the good results we're getting. And when I read your post on Facebook yesterday about this debate, I thought that I had to come. So congratulations to all of you and thank you for organizing this debate.
Jean-Marc, thank you for telling us of your experience, Jean-Marc. We're coming now to the end of the debate. I hope that you've got some answers. And thank you. You can ask questions to the panel from the floor. There is a microphone. If not, we will see the film. Don't be shy. Are there any surfers in the room? Oh, not bad. We're not going to differentiate the oldies from the youngies. We're all surfers. We'll try and continue to support the sport. Don't hesitate if you have any questions with all of these specialists and eminent people. If everybody started surfing, there'd be no more drug left for us. Well, we'd have to get up earlier to do our surfing. Well, I would like to finish on a positive note about surfing. I think it's a very beautiful time of life because it teaches us two things. One is control. Surf is a sport of joy and frustration, and is continuous. So when you come and when you dosify your joy, enjoyment, and frustration, that's a good tool for life. And then to be addicted to that is an asset. You obviously have to avoid it from becoming addiction. Frustration mustn't take you so far to lead you to being hooked and not achieving what you really want to achieve. And personally, having seen the evolution of surfing through my life, and now when you see there's a surfing session, sometimes a large number of people in the water and few waves to surf, and nevertheless people go out. Everybody goes out, and there were children, but at the end there was people were smiling, and so something is happening, and that is that violence, tension falls and disappears with the sport, and that is something that is surprising, because I think, and we can talk about that for a long time, but this relationship with that very short moment of time with the wave, and also there's also the ocean. The ocean is a landscape. It's a marvelous landscape. I don't think we'd experience the same thing with wave pools. The relationship would be quite different, and so there's this dimension of the landscape, the ocean, which is a participant in this therapy. Thank you, Jebus. Well, there we've come to the end of the debate then. So we would like to thank, I will thank on behalf of ATH, I would like to thank all the participants, Professor Auriacombe, Guillaume Baruch, Gustin Voisin, and Hugo Sabal. And we've had pleasure, as Jean-Marc said, to see you again, Hugo, and we hope that you'll be back in the water soon, hopefully. Thank you.